The first American fort built in the new territory, of Arizona, was built in 1857, 25 miles north of Tubac, by a Captain Richard Ewell, no doubt at Poston's insistence. Ewell also went on to build Camp Moore 60 miles to the south, which is practically on the border. It was near an old Tohono O'odham village, which had been built by priests in 1699, but I believe it had been abandoned due to Apache raids. Also nearby, silver had been found on a Basque rancher's land sometime before, and interestingly enough, this Basque called his ranch Arizona, which apparently in Basque means good oak tree, and that is where the name Arizona comes from. Ewell would actually write extensively about the land and the ruins he saw around him. As listeners know, the Apache weren't the first to the area of southern Arizona. That would have been the Clovis, or maybe even people before them, but the Clovis, the ancient ones, and then the Hohokam. Captain Ewell ran into quite a bit of their ruins and even wrote about them. He wrote, quote, "A great part of my scout has been in a country without inhabitants, but with the ruins of what must have been large towns abandoned centuries ago," he continues. "It would seem to be a semi-civilized people, migratory and followed by another race at war, as the schools of herring are followed by the dolphin and shark." End quote. How correct he was. He figured that race at war were the Apache. And they might well have been, although jury's still out. By 1857, the commander of the Department of New Mexico was a man named Colonel Benjamin Louis Eulalia de Bonneville, and in that year he would plan and orchestrate the fateful campaign against the Western and Chiricahua Apaches to get back at Dodge. Bonneville, as his name suggests, was born in Paris in 1796, which is not a safe time to be from that particular city. But he'd be in the U.S. with his mother by 1803. He was an interesting character. He graduated from West Point before taking leave to trap fur in the West. Something about trapping fur just brought those Frenchies out there. He took leave, but he overstayed it by 2 years, and he was subsequently dismissed from the Army, but later, President Andrew Jackson would reinstate him. Bonneville would go on to fight in the Second Seminole War in Florida before participating in the Siege of Veracruz during the Mexican-American War. Afterwards, he'd be found guilty of 3 charges for misbehavior before the enemy. Not sure what that means, but he'd be court-martialed. But also, at the same time, he earned a brevet for gallantry and meritorious conduct. He was busy. In 1855, he was sent to New Mexico, and by 1857, he was the military commander of the territory. And he wanted to use military force to overawe and once and for all placate the Apache. Spoiler alert, he would not succeed. But he did gather a force of 600 men from all over New Mexico and Arizona to avenge the murder of that Navajo agent Dodge. Carl Jacoby writes that Bonneville, quote, directed 3 U.S. Army columns, along with a spy company of Mexicans and Pueblo Indian scouts, to converge near the Gila River and to remain in the field until the Apaches in the region were never, quote, heard of again as a distinct people, end quote. So for the next month and a half, Bonneville, his Lieutenant Colonel Dixon S. Miles, and a Colonel William W. Loring, with 900 cavalrymen, soldiers, and Puebloan warriors, which was the largest concentration of troops ever fielded in Mangas' territory, while this huge force traipsed through the Mogollon Mountains around the Gila River. Bonneville rudely called the land, quote-unquote, perfectly worthless, and a, quote, most elevated and tumbled-up region, end quote. I mean, it is that. But it's perfectly beautiful, not perfectly worthless. What do the French know anyways? Obviously, the Apache under Mangas simply refused to fight and instead burned the land to deprive the army and their horses of sustenance. But after 7 weeks of wandering the beautiful southwestern land, the army came across a large band of Apaches and killed 42 of them, while taking 45 women and children prisoner. Carl Jacobi sums up what happened next. According to John Dubois, a lieutenant on the campaign, the lone male captive, quote, by Colonel Bonneville's desire or express command, was taken out with his hands tied and shot like a dog by a Pueblo Indian, not 30 yards from camp, end quote. Dubois expressed disgust at this brutish and cowardly execution, as well as a subsequent order from Bonneville that the lieutenant and several of his men conceal weapons under their uniforms and seize the Apache leaders if they came to parley under a flag of truce. I could not avoid asking myself, Dubois wondered, why we had killed these poor harmless savages. It is not pretended that they ever did any harm to us, robbing only from the Mexicans of Sonora. End all quotes. Meanwhile, Loring came upon the Apache chief and friend of Mangas, Cuchillo Negro, and his camp. When the army attacked, they killed Cuchillo Negro, 5 other men, 1 woman, and then captured 9 women and children, with Cuchillo Negro's wife being among the captured. Weeks later, short on supplies, horses, and good spirits, this large expedition abandoned the campaign. But it had its effects on the Apaches, and due to the horrifying size and immense firepower of the American force, the Chiricahua Apaches would be keeping the peace for the rest of the decade, at least in New Mexico. Because make no mistake, I stopped mentioning it and talking about it, but the Apache never stopped raiding and killing and depopulating the fractious, corrupt, and ill-ran northern Mexico, especially Sonora, and especially after the military and civilian leaders poisoned the Apache rations that they gave them. The Mexican officials under a man named Zuloaga straight up laced the Apaches' whiskey and food with poison, and many Apache fell ill or even died. Possibly over 100 were killed by being poisoned. Mangas got suspicious because he was there after the Bonneville excursion, and he forced his people back north, where he made peace with Stick. Cochise and Mangas would avoid rations for the rest of their lives, both Mexican and American rations. By the 1850s, the O'odham and the Americans were teaming up, like the O'odham had with the Spanish before, to fight against the Apache. One calendar stick even notes that in 1858, they were starting to tame the enemy. That enemy being the Apache, of course. But it wasn't just the O'odham that the U.S. Army were using against the Apaches. The Mexican vecinos, norteños, now living in the United States, people who knew the land and hated the Apache, and didn't really care that they were now Americans, they were more than willing to lend a hand to their new government, especially if it meant kill an Apache. On Bonneville's expedition, the U.S. Army used Mexicans as guides and spies. And in a town called Mesilla, many of these vecino Mexican Americans would fight back, although with dubious methods. East of the Chiricahuas, the Mescalero were continuing to have a rough go of things with the New Mexicans. In 1853, so a few years prior, a peaceful band of them came to a town called Doña Ana to meet with the Indian agent. At the agency, assembled their teepees and stayed for a while. Well, men in the nearby town of Mesilla heard about the group of Apaches and decided to take matters into their own hands. These men had recently formed a militia, and they had named it the Mesilla Guards. They then rode out to where the Mescaleros were camped and slaughtered 14 or 15 of them. 3 years later, a small band of Mescalero decided to do a little bit of raiding near Mesilla, But, predictably, the Mesilla Guards were there to greet them. 3 warriors were killed and scalped. And then, in a repeat of 1853, on the morning of April 17th, 1858, 36 Mesilla Guard militia members surprised a small group of mescaleros who had, yet again, they hadn't learned the first time, they were camped out to meet Steck. 7 Apaches, men, women, and children, were killed, and 3 others were wounded. The army raced out and captured the leader, Juan Ortega, the leader of the Mesilla Guard. They captured him and his 35 men. And when they captured him, they had mescalero children in their possession. So the men were arrested, but here's what John Upton Terrell writes of the outcome of their arrest. Quote, "Town officials immediately got off post-haste letters to the Secretary of War, and town and civil officials in Santa Fe protested that the imprisonment of Ortega and the other American citizens was a gross outrage committed by the commander at Fort Thorne." He continues, "Civil officials demanded the release of the Mesilla Guards, and, having no orders to the contrary, the commander was obliged to free them. They were never punished. Indeed, they were never charged with having committed some 30 murders." End quote. Well then, a few days later, that war chief of the Mescalero, Gomez, who was hiding out in the Davis Mountains, he rode into Doñana at the head of 100 heavily armed warriors. As soon as he had arrived, he announced that he had come to kill every Mesilla Guard. Every one of them that his warriors could get their hands on. Thankfully, though, Steck was there to convince him that that was a terrible idea. Honestly, Steck was very good at his job. Gomez took the hint of how bad reprisals would be for not only his warriors, but the mescaleros in the mountains. And he headed back for the Davis Mountains and Big Bend area of Texas. Much peace actually reigned in 1860, at least in the United States. Mexico, of course, was another story. As John Upton Terrell puts it, they, quote, "would not, of course, cease their raiding into Mexico. There could be no peace under any conditions with Mexicans as long as an Apache of any band was alive. But they could, at least for the time being, hold their high mountain sanctuaries with greater ease if they allowed the overland coaches and wagon trains to go on their way unharmed." End quote. But in late 1860, an event occurred that would start one of the longest wars in United States history. The quote-unquote Apache Wars. Because believe it or not, the United States was not yet at war with the Apache despite its many incursions into Apacheria. But that was about to change with the kidnapping of a small half-Mexican boy. In southern Arizona, an Irishman named Johnny Ward, who had come to the Sonoita Valley around the time of Poston, who I talked about earlier, they were actually friends. But Ward came to southern Arizona to settle and to ranch. In the meantime, he met a beautiful Mexican woman named Jesus Maria Martinez, but she went by Modesto. Not long after they met, she, her daughter, and her curiously red-headed, one-eyed son, Felix, moved in towards considerable frontier stone and adobe home. Felix, the red-haired boy with the Mexican mother and only one eye, was about to change history through no fault of his own. The Ward family was in the heart of Western Apache, and while this was a relatively peaceful time throughout the land, at least between the U.S. and the Apache, there was still small outbreaks of violence by Apaches who needed to make war for whatever various reasons. One of those Apaches, leading a small raid in January of 1861, was named Beto. Beto was an Aravaipa Western Apache. He was from that same place, beautiful place, that the Apache kid was from. Well, actually, that's not quite correct. Beto was really named Victor, and while he lived in Aravaipa Canyon, he was from Mexico. He was a captive Mexican, but he had adopted the Apache ways and had risen in the ranks to become a war leader. Like the out-of-place little Felix Beto only had one eye, and on his scarred face he wore an eye patch. Beto and his small band of warriors wanted two things in this raid: cattle and horses, and they knew Johnny Ward had them. Their people were hungry. Beto wanted no deaths in this raid. He only hoped for spoils to feed he and his people. Eventually, after leaving the village on horseback, the Apache village, he and his warriors came to Johnny Ward's sprawling ranch filled with exactly what Beto was looking for. I will now let Paul Andrew Hutton's fantastic words fill you in on what happened next. 9 warriors slowly approached the quiet ranch house while another group rounded up the cattle across the creek. Beto rode over to the little peach orchard near where the cattle grazed. A boy had climbed up into one of the small, bare trees in his fright. Usually, the Apaches would kill a boy this age, either during a raid or later in the village, but Beto, for some reason, did not kill the boy. Instead, he motioned for him to come down from the tree and climb up behind him on his horse. The one-eyed warrior could see that the boy also had but one eye. The boy's blind eye, recently hooked by a wounded deer, was not covered with a patch. A sudden cry went up. 2 riders were coming. The warriors, charging the ranch house, hurried back to their ponies while the others gathered in the cattle. Beto led the way north with the captive boy clinging to his back. End quote. The White Eyes would pursue the Apaches, but they would not overtake them. Beto, Felix, the captured boy, and his warriors, with 20 head of cattle, would escape. Once Johnny Ward, who had been out of town, once he returned, he found his woman in shambles and his adopted son gone. Modesto, after all, was a Norteño. She knew the depredations of the Apache well. Her hometown was probably now a ghost town. But now, her home felt like one. Once word got to the American military, which were about 12 miles away, the commander sent an inexperienced Kentuckian named 2nd Lieutenant George Nicholas Bascom and his 7th Infantry, as well as some dragoons. He sent them all on the trail of the raiders. Eventually, Bascom and his men came to an area known as Apache Pass, and he believed it was the Apaches that lived nearby Apache Pass, who had stolen the boy and the cattle. He was wrong, but he sure thought he was onto something right. Unfortunately for our story, the Apaches that lived near the so-called Apache Pass were that of Cochise. At this time, Apache Pass was Cochise's stronghold, and it was a beautiful area that had water by means of a spring. It is at like the north end of the Chiricahua Mountains. It really is a pretty spot. It was an area with steep cliffs on either side of this little valley, this pass. There were trees and game. It was an oasis at the top of the Sky Island mountain chain, again known as Chiricahua Mountains. Nearby the spring and the pass is something known as Dos Cabezas, which I actually drove under, these 2 mountains, in July of 2023. The 2 noteworthy peaks, in my opinion, formed the ears, with the peak to the south of them forming the muzzle of my dog who had passed away a few months before. I actually took a picture as we were driving, and later I overlaid the drawing of my dog on top of the mountains. And I will put that up on the site for this episode. Apache Pass was also extremely close to the nearby, very important, to the White Eyes at least, Butterfield Overland Mail Stagecoach Station. I knew nothing about this very important route until researching, but Paul Andrew Hutton had the best description out of the few that I read, so I will let him tell it. The Butterfield Overland Mail Company station was an integral part of the new mail system being built to provide a vital official link between the East and California. The first overland mail had been inaugurated for September 16, 1858, when an all-weather southern route had been selected by the U.S. Postmaster General. The federal mail contract, worth $600,000 a year, plus some choice parcels of public land, had been awarded to John Butterfield, former stage driver, freight line operator, and co-founder of the American Express Company. Butterfield was required to carry passengers and deliver the mail semi-weekly within a 25-day one-way trip. Postage was 10 cents per letter. Passenger fare from St. Louis to San Francisco was $200 one way. The total length of the contracted route was a bone-jarring 2,795 miles. Butterfield's achievement was truly monumental. He carefully supervised the building of bridges, the grading of existing roads, and the digging of wells at the 141 stations that had to be established. Corrals, barns, and outbuildings were constructed, and then stocked with 1,000 horses and 500 mules. He employed 800 men in various capacities, from drivers to stock tenders to station managers. It was hard, dangerous work, but it provided the main artery of connection to the states of the far western settlements. End quote. So clearly, this station in the heart of Apacheria, it was vastly important to the Americans. Its safety had been in the articles of many a treaty between the states and the various Apache nations who had signed treaties. Cochise, he understood that. Cochise respected and guaranteed the stagecoach's safety. He brought the station hay and wood. He returned stolen livestock and horses. Cochise was actually on quite good terms with the station master, a man named James Tevis, and Cochise and his band often camped about a mile from the station. But then, in May of 1860, when the Chiricahuas were trying desperately to keep the peace with the Americans, gold was discovered near Santa Rita del Cobre. That bleak thorn in the side of the Chiricahuas for over 50 years, overnight, quite literally, Americans and Mexicans flooded into the area that would be called Pinos Altos, or Tall Pines. In May of 2024, my wife and I stopped into the old town of Pinos Altos to check it out. We stopped in the Buckhorn Saloon and Opera House, we walked the old streets, and we sat at the finish line of the international bike race known as Tour of the Gila. We did not know that the tour was that very weekend, that we were planning on being there, so the place was absolutely packed. Some of the roads were closed. It didn't ruin our trip, but it sure did make us go out of the way. It doesn't matter, though. That area is absolutely beautiful. Pinos Altos is on one end of the Trail of the Mountain Spirits, as it's called today, Trail of the Mountain Spirits Scenic Byway. And that is at the southern end of the Mogollon Mountains, not too far north of Silver City, maybe just 10 minutes. It is a very small town in an absolutely gorgeous part of the American Southwest. As I've said before, the entire Mogollon Mountains region is impossibly beautiful. Mangas knew what was up when he settled and kept his people there. Unfortunately, the fact that he called the area home is why he would eventually be forced to take up arms against the United States of America, after so many years of seeking peace. I did not know when I visited the small town, despite having just released the second episode in the series. I didn't know how important Pinos Altos would be in this episode and to the end of Mangas Coloradas' life. After the gold was discovered, Tevis, the station master who was close with Cochise, he quit his job and headed east to get that gold. He was replaced by a man named Charles Culver. With Culver at the station were two workers, Robert Welch and James Wallace. James Wallace was the stagecoach driver. Wallace, he'd been there a while. He was also friendly with Cochise. And then there's a quick and very important side I must say about Tevis. After he made it east to Pinos Altos, he would actually lead a charge of some 30 miners into an Apache camp near the town on one day in October of 1860. These miners would slay 4 Apaches and kidnap many others before being surrounded by angry Chiricahuas seeking revenge. Mangas was most likely among those seeking revenge. Tevis and the miners would be saved only by the army, and they would never be punished for those murders. Mangas would never forget them. According to historians, this was the second of 3 reasons that the Chiricahua went to war with the Americans. The first was the simple fact that their territory was getting overrun. And the third was the forthcoming Bascom affair that I am about to dive deep into after setting up the Apache Pass. But before I do, I must mention, despite so many of the sources, all but Sweeney, actually, but despite so many of the sources recounting the story, there is no evidence that the legend of Mangas Coloradas being tied to a tree and whipped by miners at Pinos Altos, that is not true. The only source of that apocryphal tale is Criminy, and he is not reliable, as I have said before. While the story makes sense from a neat, well-rounded revenge standpoint, Mangas never mentions it himself. Ever. Sweeney writes of the story, quote, "While there is nothing inherently improbable about the story, it is certainly open to question." End quote. He then goes on to prove, through exhaustive research, that Criminy is the sole source for this tall tale. Therefore, it is unlikely that it is true. So, Mangas never got whipped after being tied to a tree at Pinos Altos. He just didn't like his people being overran, attacked, and then what was about to happen to Cochise's family. On January 29th, 1861, Bascom, with an interpreter named Antonio Bonillas, Johnny Ward, the stepfather of Felix, and 54 infantrymen mounted on mules, they all left the fort near Tucson, and they headed for Apache Pass, the station, Cochise, and infamy. Along the way, though, Bascom ran into a Sergeant Daniel Robinson and his 12 men. Robinson will come up quite a bit. Bascom then recruited them for the coming mission right there on the spot. Once they'd all made it to the station, Bascom told Wallace, the stagecoach driver, who was also on good terms with Cochise, he told him to send Cochise a message. Bascom wanted a meeting. Cochise promptly returned the reply of, "I'll be there tomorrow." So far, so good, although Cochise definitely didn't know what he was in for. At noon the next day, as the army men were all sitting down to lunch, Cochise arrived with his wife, his 6-year-old child, future Chief Naiche, that's his child, his brother, and 3 other Apache adults, and 1 more Apache child. So clearly, he brought all these people because he had no idea of the coming battle. I mean, he wouldn't have brought his vulnerable family members if he knew what was about to happen. After arriving, Cochise and his brother, Coyuntura, were invited into the tent of Bascom for the coming meeting. But immediately after entering the tent, the Apache chief, he had to have sensed something was wrong. Bascom called over the sergeant, Robinson, that he'd met on the road, and he ordered him to tie the mules to the wagons, bring in all the herds, and place sentries around the camp, 'cause he basically said no Apache was leaving without Bascom's explicit instructions. Bascom then offered the 2 Apache warriors some coffee. Also in the tent, acting as interpreter, was Johnny Ward, the stepfather of Felix, the kidnapped boy. After issuing the orders, Bascom wasted no more time. In English, Bascom asked Cochise to return the boy and the cattle. Johnny Ward then translated this into Spanish to Cochise, and Cochise replied in broken Spanish that, "Well, we don't have whatever boy you're talking about, and we know nothing about no stinking stolen cattle either. At least not this time. But if Cochise could have a little bit of time, he'd no doubt find this boy that was apparently taken by some Apaches from somewhere." He even speculated that the culprits of stealing the boy were probably Western Coyotero Apaches. Ward then turned to Bascom and told him all of that in English. And Bascom replied with, "That is not going to work. You and your people will stay here until the boy is returned," he essentially said. Ward turned to Cochise, began translating the horrible news into Spanish, but even before he could finish, Cochise and his brother simultaneously whipped out their knives and sprang for the back of the tent, where Cochise cut a hole in the canvas and slipped out. Apparently, as they left, Bascom shouted, "Shoot them down!" which gave Johnny Ward the confidence to pull his pistol and fire. The bullet hit Cochise in the leg, but he continued to run. I assume the adrenaline had allowed him not to feel that. His brother wasn't as fast, and he lagged behind, and he got captured. But Cochise, he ran and eventually made it to the boulder-strewn canyon wall, which he ascended as quickly as he could, all the while leaving a bloody trail on every rock. Meanwhile, the soldiers, not stuffing their faces, had begun to fire after Cochise as well. Bullets ricocheted off the boulders. The Sergeant Robinson that was tasked with gathering the animals, he heard the shots, turned around, and saw an Apache man being chased by a soldier. The Apache apparently hurled rocks at the soldier, who shielded his head as the Apache fled behind more Chiricahua-style rocks from like the National Monument. The towering, stacked, it's a really cool place. But as this soldier began again to chase the Apache brave lunged at the soldier from the boulder. But the soldier was quicker than expected, and he put a hole in the Apache warrior. I don't think he killed him. I think he just took him prisoner, though. One other Apache attempted to escape, but he was pinned to the ground by a soldier with a bayonet. After the brief fracas, Coyuntura and the remaining Apache were herded at bayonet point into a tent as prisoners. Paul Andrew Hutton writes of the end of the scene and says, quote, "From the ridgetop, Cochise looked down on the soldier camp. Only then did he realize that he had been wounded in the leg and that, inexplicably, he still carried a tin coffee cup in his hand." End quote. Now, as fantastic as that story is, a lot of those details were gleaned from the previously mentioned unreliable criminy. But the story of Cochise escaping and what happens next is true. After no doubt surveying his own damage, the bullet hole, and letting the adrenaline die down, about an hour after the escape, Cochise again appeared at the ridgeline, much to Bascom's surprise. Cochise then shouted down, essentially like, "Show me my brother and my family so that I may know they're alive. If they are, I'll spare you." Bascom's reply was a volley of bullets. To that, Cochise replied, "Indian blood was as good as white man's blood." And then he was gone. Paul Andrew Hutton writes of what happened next. The young lieutenant suddenly seemed to realize just what he had done. Wallace, the stage driver, was enraged by Bascom's actions and berated the lieutenant in front of the men. Bascom, totally unnerved, ordered his men to break camp and move down to the stout stone walls of the stage station. Sergeant Robinson pointed out that they would need water from the spring farther up the canyon. But Bascom feared an ambush there. "Lieutenant, one may better be shot than die of thirst," Robinson replied. "I will go to the spring." Robinson brought back several canteens filled with water, then later returned to the spring with a burro to secure 2 kegs of water. At dusk, as the men settled in at the stage station, they saw the orange glow of Apache signal fires on every surrounding mountain peak. It would be a very long night. End quote. Those signal fires that the men saw, they sent their message of help about as well as the lighting of the beacons did in Return of the King. The next morning, after the soldiers had awakened, they noticed the hills and cliff walls surrounding the station were filled with hundreds of Apache warriors. Warriors under Mangas Coloradas, Geronimo, a white mountain Apache leader named Francisco. They would all remember this momentous event that would forever sour the relationship between the Americans and the Apache. They would call it the time Cochise cut the tent. Cochise sent an Indian with a white flag down to Bascom to ask for a meeting, a parley. Bascom agreed. And then a Sergeant William Smith, Johnny Ward, the stepfather, and Sergeant Robinson, who'd gathered the water and had been stopped on the road, they all accompanied Bascom to the meeting. The 4 Americans then met with Cochise and 3 of his unarmed warriors. In the meeting, Cochise demanded that Bascom release his people. Ward again translated to Bascom, who replied that he would only do that. He would only release his people if Cochise released the captured boy. The captured boy whom Cochise had not captured. Ward translated this to Bascom. All the while, Apaches had slowly and stealthily been approaching them. And Bascom had noticed. Actually, all the Americans had noticed this. And then Cochise said, "Hey, I have not captured this boy, but we will find him when Bascom releases my people." But then Wallace, the stagecoach driver, who knew Cochise, he had wandered into the Apache camp, kind of on accident with 2 other workers. And at that moment, Wallace was captured by the Apaches. The two other workers of the station, they fled for the American line. And at that moment, the Americans opened fire. And Cochise and his warriors had to turn around and retreat to their side of this ravine. And then they all returned fire. Many Apache were killed. But also Sergeant Smith and the worker, Culver, one of the workers, they were hit and killed as well. That night, the fires were lit again. The siege on the station would continue. 2 days later, the brother of the slain Culver who worked at the station, he arrived at the station, but he had no idea what had taken place. Simultaneously, Geronimo and his warriors had seen and ambushed a train of wagons heading to the station. They killed 6 Mexican men before the Apaches captured the 5 remaining men. One of them that was captured was a German, another was a mixed-blood Cherokee man. There was an Anglo-American and 2 more Mexicans that were all captured. What happened next is gnarly, and I will let Paul Andrew Hutton tell the story. Cochise had the 3 white men bound so they could watch as their Hispanic companions were lashed to the wheels of the wagons. The chief had obviously decided that only the white men had bargaining value. Geronimo's men then set fire to the wagons. The reflective glow from the fire could be seen in the clouds above the stage station. But the distance was too great to be able to hear the screams of the roasting men. End quote. On February 7th, yet another wagon filled with Americans arrived through a hail of Apache gunfire and arrows. They made it to the station. Word of the siege on the station had not yet made it out of Apache Pass. No one knew it was even going on. Bascom needed to send for help. So the night of February 8th, he sent out 1 wagon to the east and 1 to the west. They both would actually make it to their intended targets. Therefore, troopers and adventurers from various western forts and towns would soon be on their way to the station at Apache Pass. On February 9th, though, the next day, the Apaches attacked. Bascom desperately needed to water the animals and gather some own water for his men, so he sent a small group of his men to the spring. But as they approached, the Apache attacked. Sergeant Robinson was actually hit. Back at the station, hearing the melee outside, a fight which was out of view, the fight at the spring, Bascom turned to future Brigadier General of the Confederate States of America, Lieutenant John Rogers Cook, and asked him to go relieve the men at the spring. He would go do so bravely. Back at the station, Cochise led his warriors on an assault. He had thought that Bascom would have sent way more of his men to help those at the spring, but instead, Bascom did not fall for it, and he kept the bulk of his forces behind cover at the station. After intense fighting and a failed charge, Cochise was forced to abandon the dangerous and costly frontal assault. After regrouping, he decided that the Chiricahua would scatter to the mountains. He was forced to leave his family there at the station. But the Bascom affair was not over yet. Although war to the knife had now been declared on the Americans by the Chiricahua Indians. No longer was peace an option in the minds of Cochise, Geronimo, and Mangas Coloradas. On February 10th, one of the relief parties of men and a surgeon arrived to the station. On the way there, they'd actually captured 3 Western Apache men, and when they arrived, they were bound as prisoners. 4 days later, the second relief party arrived, led by the higher-ranking Lieutenant Moore. He was higher-ranked than Bascom. And then on February 16th, Moore sent out men into the Chiricahua mountains and wilderness to search for these Apache warriors that had besieged the station. Something that Bascom probably should have done already. These men, their first discovery on the 19th of February, were the bodies of 4 dead, mangled, picked at by vultures men. Paul Andrew Hutton writes, quote, "The corpses were so riddled with lance wounds that they had probably been unrecognizable even before the vultures had feasted on them. But Uri, who knew Wallace well, was able to identify the stage driver's body by the gold fillings in his teeth." End quote. So Wallace, the station worker, and the other captured prisoners had all been killed by Cochise and his warring Apaches. After all, murder must be met with revenge, according to the Apache. Back at the once besieged station, legend says a card game determined the fate of the Apache prisoners. Moore had wanted to hang him, and Bascom had not. But according to the legend, Moore won the card game, so the Apaches were to hang. Coyuntura, Cochise's brother, 2 more of his warriors, and the 3 captured Western Apache were all sent to the happy place with elongated necks. Sergeant Robinson wrote later that, quote, "The Indians were hoisted so high by the infantry that even the wolves could not touch them." End quote. Robinson, he wasn't sure how to take the whole affair, and he'd also write later, quote, "It was a sad spectacle to look upon, an illustration of the Indians' sense of justice, that the innocent must suffer for the guilty, and that man's notion that the only good Indians are dead ones." End quote. Dostese and Naiche, Cochise's wife and his child, along with the other small Apache boy, they were spared. And they would be released in March of 1861. And they'd head back to their Chiricahua relatives, who were now planning on waging war against the Americans. Mangas Coloradas and Cochise's war, their war against the White Eyes, it will begin at the same time that the White Eyes themselves were warring with each other. This turn of events will see the Chiricahua and Greater Apache pretty much take back almost all of their lands in a considerably quick time frame. But that is all for the next episode. For the remainder of this one, I must finish the long and violent life of Mangas Coloradas. Cochise would attack southern Arizona after the Bascom affair and kill 9 Americans. He'd capture 2 of them, and then he, according to Sweeney, quote, "roasted them upside down with their heads suspended 18 inches above the fire." End quote. Meanwhile, Mangas wanted to attack Pinos Altos, which by now, on account of events the Apaches would not yet understand, but Pinos Altos went from 500 men to 100 men. The Butterfield Overland Stage also completely abandoned the territory. And then the forts were abandoned. And the soldiers left. And with them, the territory slowly lost its safety-conscious residents. The ones that still wanted to stay alive. The Tucson Arizonian newspaper described the desperate times like this, quote, "Our prosperity has departed. The mail is withdrawn. The soldiers are gone and the garrisons burned to the ground. The miners murdered and the mines abandoned. The stock raisers and farmers have abandoned their crops and herds to the Indians. And the population generally have fled, panic-struck and naked in search of refuge. From end to end of the territory, except in Tucson and its immediate vicinity, there is not a human habitation." End quote. The Apaches thought this was all they were doing. It was not. At around 70 years old, Mangas was still, surprisingly, a war chief. But at the same time, his younger and bolder and incredibly skilled son-in-law, Cochise, the main focus of our next episode, Cochise, he kind of took the reins. And he attracted a whole lot more warriors. And he would lead the charge for most of this time period. The 2 men, Cochise and Mangas Coloradas, they brought their combined groups to a place known as Cook's Canyon. And that became their base of operations for the beginning of their war against the Americans. Cook's Canyon, by the way, is southeast of the Mogollon Black Mountains, where Pinos Altos is, and it's the mountains that we've been talking about for most of this episode. Cook's Canyon is just north of Highway 10 between Deming and Las Cruces. And Las Cruces could also be called Mesilla, like the Mesilla Guards. Between 1861 and 1863, the Apaches would ambush and kill over 100 whites in Cook's Canyon. It would later be described as being, quote, sadly defaced with human bones and graves." End quote. One soldier would write in his journal about Cook's Canyon that he, quote, "found many bones, skulls, and graves." End quote. From Cook's Canyon, the two Apache war chiefs killed and mutilated the corpses of what was known as the Free Thomas Party. All 7 Americans perished. 9 Mexican vaqueros were killed and horribly mutilated a short time later in the canyon as they were heading with cattle from Mesilla to Pinos Altos. Shortly after that, what's known as the Ache Party, which included many famous Westerners and mountain men, including Kit Carson's half-brother, they were ambushed in a thrilling shootout between themselves and the Apache led by Cochise and Mangas Coloradas. The Apache took 400 cattle and 900 sheep in this battle. They also inflicted 4 deaths and quite a few injuries upon the Americans. But among the Americans, all of the women and children left safely. Mangas, because of these Americans' bravery and how they fought, he did not let his people later mutilate the corpses. Arizona Confederates would actually pursue Cochise's band south immediately after this Ache massacre. These Arizona Confederates would pursue them as they were trying to enter Mexico to sell their loot, as was obviously customary now that the war had begun against the Americans. So now the Apaches were selling American goods to the Mexicans. These Confederates would kill 8 Apaches after both camps had traveled all night after the massacre. And they'd re-secure all of the stolen livestock. This group of New Mexican and Arizona Confederates called themselves the Arizona Guard, and they had their headquarters in Pinos Altos, which was the only other Anglo town west of the Rio Grande, like in the whole area, except for Tucson. And Tucson was pretty far away. After this attack against Cochise, Mangas and his group met with his son-in-law, Cochise, and the two, with their enormous band of warriors, decided to strike back at the Anglos at Pinos Altos. They did so at the first sign of daybreak on September 27, 1861, when the Apaches simultaneously began the battle at every spaced-out camp in the small town. The fighting was incredible, and eventually by noon it was hand-to-hand. War to the knife. On the main street outside a hardware store known as Roman's Supply Store. That is where most of the fighting by noon was taking place. Inside the store, many miners, as in people who mine, and what few women that lived in the town, they loaded the town's cannon with nails and buckshot, and they fired this cannon at the Apaches that were regrouping on the main thoroughfare in the town right in front of Roman's Supply Store. After the cannon shot, the Anglos mounted a furious counterattack, and the Apaches were forced to flee. During the battle, it was reported, or I guess after the battle, 5 Americans died and many, many more Apaches perished. But the true toll on the Anglos was the immediate desertions of miners and men from Pinos Altos. After the fight, only 70 people would remain. In retaliation of their many dead, not sure how many, but in retaliation the Apaches would go on to attack, kill, and torture what various wagon trains dared to pass through the territory. And after each attack, the Arizona Guard would mount up and chase them away. That is, at least until they too, the Arizona Guard, they were chased away by California Yankees. These Yankees would enter Apache Pass on July 14, 1862, where they were predictably ambushed by Cochise, Mangas Coloradas, Victorio, Nana, Ho, and many other Apache leaders and their many, many warriors. But the Yanks would prevail, mostly on account of them shelling the Apaches' hiding places with howitzers over 40 times. The battle began with the over 70-year-old Mangas Coloradas and over 50-year-old Cochise leading their men in hand-to-hand combat. Again, war to the knife. These two storied, older Apache warrior chiefs, they led their men after an initial volley of bullets. but they were repelled to the rocks that surrounded that all-important spring. So this was again at the same stage station. Same stage station in Apache Pass. The army, after the fighting began, the army ran for the stage station while the Apaches ran to the spring. Essentially, this was a repeat of the Bascom affair. But after some intense fighting, the Yanks would take the high ground, shell the Apaches, and chase them away from the spring. At some point, though, Mangas had snuck away and was blocking the western side of the pass, of Apache Pass. And there, yet another battle broke out, with men trying to relieve the besieged men at the pass. And this fight was led by Mangas Coloradas himself. I mentioned this in the very beginning of the episode. Private John Teal would describe what happened next. Quote, "The Indians then turned toward me. I had mounted and fired my carbine at them. They closed in around me, both mounted and on foot. The chief or commander of the Indians was armed with a citizen rifle, but was unwilling to fire at me without arrest, so, after rallying his warriors, he ran for arrest, and I after him. But on looking over my shoulder, I saw the mounted Indians too close on my rear for safety. So I turned on them, and they scattered like birds. I turned again to tend to the old chief, but I was too late. He had got to a bunch of galleta, and was lying on his belly on the opposite side of the bunch, pointed straight at me, which caused me to drop from the horse on the ground, and the Indian shot the horse instead of me. The horse left, and I laid low, sending a bullet at them whenever I had a chance. We kept firing until it was dark, when a lucky shot from me sent the chief off in the arms of his Indians." End quote. Private John Teal had just shot Mangas Coloradas. After the long battle, the old chief was taken by Cochise and his Chiricahua to Chihuahua, where he was patched up by a Mexican doctor that was told, if you don't fix him, you die. Mangas Coloradas would survive. And so would the doctor, I assume. After that, Mangas Coloradas would return up north to settle down, to farm, to make peace. He had no more war left in him. But the leader of the California Yankees, General James Carleton, he would make sure that Mangas paid for his recent depredations. Mangas and all of the Apaches. As Sweeney puts it, quote, "We can explain Carleton's Apache philosophy in one word: extermination." End quote. At Pinos Altos, Mangas attempted to find a White Eyes that would send a message to Santa Fe, and that message would say that, hey, I want peace, I will make a deal. He wanted peace so bad he even went to Acoma a second time to ask for it there, but still no luck. Back at Pinos Altos, Mangas Coloradas had a conversation with a drunk ex-Arizona Guard member named Jack Swilling. And during this conversation, Mangas admitted to taking part in one of the many raids on the wagon trains in Cook Canyon. To this, Jack Swilling apparently told Mangas to his face that he was going to kill him for that. Mangas ignored the threat. Jack Swilling was not bluffing, though, and after he had teamed up with some gold prospectors, led by a famous mountain man named Captain Joseph Redford Walker, all of the men, they hatched a plan to capture an Apache leader, preferably Mangas, so that they can, at this point, use this captured Apache leader to safely mine the area, using him as a hostage. As this group was on their way out of town, they ran into an army captain named Edmund Sherland, who had with him 20 men. And this was just great news. Swilling and Walker told Sherland of their brand new plan, and Sherland, under orders to kill Mangas Coloradas by Carleton, he obviously liked this plan, and he decided to join in, he and his 20 men. They then headed back to Pinos Altos, where they raised a white flag, called for Mangas, and waited a day and a half for him to come in and make quote-unquote peace. Despite everyone begging Mangas to not trust these Americans, he went to Pinos Altos to sue for peace anyways. He just wanted to grow old, or older, and to plant. And for some reason, as he always had, he still trusted the Americans. With around a dozen men, which included old Victorio, someone we'll talk about next time, but with a dozen men, Mangas came into camp on January 17th around noon. The soldiers were hiding amongst the various brush and rocks. Mangas did not notice them at first. Jack Swilling approached Mangas and informed him of the situation in broken Spanish. One man that was there and who was a member of Jack Swelling's party, a man named Daniel Ellis Connor, he would later write to historian James McClintock, who would publish what happened next. Quote, "When our squad suddenly leveled our guns upon the party, for the first time Mangas showed appreciation of his serious position. Swilling went up to him and laid his hand on the chief's shoulder and finally convinced him that resistance meant destruction of the whole party." End quote. Essentially, Swilling would tell Mangas that you are now being detained so that we can go through Apacheria and paying for our gold unharmed. You, Mangas, said Swilling, are our leverage for staying alive. But your men can go. As Victorio, one of Mangas's sons, not sure which one, and the other Apaches left, Mangas apparently told them, quote, they were not fooling with Mexicans now. End quote. On January 18th, as the military was escorting Mangas to Fort McLean, which is not too far from today's Silver City, Mangas's son would beg the army to see his father. After the meeting, Mangas's son was seen leaving the escort with tears in his eyes. At Fort McLean, Jack Swilling turned Mangas over to Brigadier General Joseph Rodman West. According to an eyewitness, Mangas towered over West, who, quote, looked like a pygmy beside the old chief, end quote. Sweeney sums up what happened next, quote, West informed Mangas, quote, you have murdered your last white victim, you old scoundrel, end quote. He gestured to the east, where Cook's Canyon lay, and remarked that it was covered with the bleached bones of Mangas's victims. Mangas, though disinclined to speak at all, responded that he had fought only in self-defense, only after, quote, we were attacked by the white man who came digging up my hills for the yellow iron, end quote. A claim that was undeniably true from the chief's perception. The general then told Mangas that he would not seek to avenge all the atrocities that Mangas had carried out against Americans. Instead, West magnanimously advised the chief that, quote, the remainder of his days would be spent as a prisoner in the hands of United States authorities, that his family would be permitted to join him, and they would be well treated, end quote. Mangas refused the offer. The last thing West told Mangas was that if he tried to escape, the guards would shoot him down. But later, he'd return to the guards and tell them, according to Clark Stocking, quote, men, that old murderer has got away from every soldier command and has left a trail of blood for 500 miles on the old stage line. I want him dead or alive tomorrow morning. Do you understand? I want him dead. End quote. As the 18th turned into the 19th, two of the guards on that freezing night began to heat their bayonets and poke the old chief on his exposed feet and legs. Either that, or they launched hot coals at him, or even pieces of the adobe wall. They would break some off and just kind of toss them at him. Regardless of the method, the men were trying to get the old chief to rise from his sleeping position. Eventually, after enough torture, that's just what Mangas did. He raised himself from the ground and yelled in Spanish at the two soldiers that he was no child to be playing with. The soldiers, in unison, raised their rifles and shot the old warrior in the chest as soon as he'd finished his chastisement. Immediately afterwards, they bayoneted him before another soldier with a pistol came over to the Apache who lay face down on the ground and shot him through the back of the head. The bullet took some of his forehead and nasal cavity with it as it struck into the ground. The camp, startled by the noise, eventually returned to bed satisfied when they found out what happened. When West was informed of his death, the brigadier general told the guards they could now, quote, go to sleep, end quote. The official report was that Mangas Coloradas was shot while trying to escape. West would claim he tried to escape 3 times, and on the 3rd time, he was finally put down. Therefore, West wrote, quote, the good faith of the U.S. military authorities was in no way compromised, end quote. This was a lie, and over the years, the true story would slowly come out from these men that were there. The next morning, one of the soldiers took his bowie knife and scalped the chief. Later that day, they drag him to a gully and throw some dirt on him. But a few days later, a group of soldiers with a surgeon examined Mangas Coloradas' disinterred body. That was the surgeon that wrote the write-up. The surgeon, named Sturgeon, severed Mangus's head from his body. Even later, another surgeon, a different one, came through the area. This one was named Surgeon John Quincy Adams. Yes, nephew of the ex-president. He would take a thigh bone. When it was discovered the head had already been taken. In Yves Ball's Inde, Dakluji would comment on this murderous execution, and he would say, quote, to an Apache, the mutilation of the body is much worse than death, because the body must go through eternity in the mutilated condition. Little did the White Eyes know what they were starting when they mutilated Mangas Coloradas. While there was little mutilation previously, it was nothing compared to what was to follow. End quote. In the next episode, we will find out what was to follow. Thank y'all for listening, and I'll see you again soon in the American Southwest.